dim the lights. Let the room grow quiet as though the centuries themselves are preparing to whisper. Tonight's journey begins with a myth so persistent, so deeply lodged in our collective imagination that it feels almost impolite to question it. You have heard it before at school in glossy documentaries, even tossed casually across dinner tables. The myth that in the Middle Ages the earth was thought to be flat. A giant plate floating in the void with dragons, sea monsters, and the yawning abyss of nothingness waiting for any sailor reckless enough to push too far. It is a cinematic picture, isn't it? Nervous sailors peering over the ship's edge, hearts pounding at the thought that one more league forward might drop them into the cosmic pit. It is so vivid that it has stayed alive for generations. Yet it is also a complete fabrication. Medieval people, scholars, and even sailors did not believe they were walking across the surface of a giant pancake. They knew, as their ancestors had known, that the earth was round. The Greeks had measured it more than 1,000 years before the Middle Ages ever began. Eratosthenes, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, had taken 2 sticks, 2 cities, and the power of sunlight to calculate the Earth's circumference with a level of accuracy so impressive it could humble modern minds. His method was preserved in texts that passed into the hands of medieval scholars who read and debated them in the echoing halls of monasteries and the lecture chambers of Europe's earliest universities. Far from fretting over falling off the edge of the world, monks were studying the mathematics of the heavens, drawing globes, and teaching astronomy and Latin to eager pupils. Even ordinary sailors knew the Earth's shape from experience. They had seen it with their own eyes. As ships moved across the horizon, the mast always slipped away, first vanishing like a quill, sinking into ink, followed by the hull. If the earth were flat, the whole ship would disappear at once. It didn't require a doctorate or even literacy to understand what the eyes confirmed: the sea itself was curved. The flat earth myth took root centuries later in the 19th century, when writers eager to dramatize Columbus's voyage painted him as a lonely visionary defying a world of ignorant flat earthers. Washington Irving's romanticized biography of Columbus turned the navigator into a tragic hero mocked by medieval simpletons who insisted he would sail off the edge. It made a great story, and in history, as in gossip, the story that flatters us usually wins. By portraying the Middle Ages as a dark and foolish era, 19th century authors made their own time seem enlightened, logical, and brave. The real debate in Columbus's age was not whether the earth was round. That was settled knowledge. The true question was its size. Columbus believed the planet was far smaller than it really is, imagining Asia could be reached quickly by sailing west. Without the Americas conveniently blocking his path, this era would have meant disaster, starvation in the heart of the Pacific with no land in sight. He gambled not against superstition but against distance. If you look at medieval art, you'll find Christ holding an orb, the globus cruciger, symbolizing dominion over a spherical world. Kings, too, were painted with globes in their hands, as if geography itself had been fashioned into an emblem of authority. These were not men clutching frisbees of divine power, but spheres, shining reminders of the round earth they ruled beneath. And yet the myth endures because it satisfies something in us. It is easier to believe in a Middle Ages of ignorance than to accept that people in robes centuries before the printing press were debating geometry and tracking the heavens. But they were, and their knowledge was not isolated. From Arabic translations of Ptolemy to the star charts of Islamic astronomers passed into Latin Europe through Spain and Sicily, the medieval world was stitched together by a web of intellectual exchange. The Earth's roundness was not a secret but a fact repeated across continents, languages, and faiths. So, the next time you hear someone chuckle about medieval sailors fearing the edge of the world, imagine instead a monk hunched over a manuscript by candlelight, carefully copying diagrams of arcs and shadows. Imagine a sailor squinting across the sea, watching the slow disappearance of a ship and knowing in his bones what it meant. Imagine kings holding globes not as ornaments but as signs of a truth their people had long understood. The flat earth was never their fear. It is our invention, a myth born not of medieval ignorance but of modern arrogance. And in that small realization, the Middle Ages suddenly feel less distant, less alien. Their people were not staring into a void of darkness, they were standing as we still stand on a sphere turning endlessly beneath the same unbroken sky. Picture, if you will, the Middle Ages as painted by popular culture. Dark, smoky streets filled with ragged peasants, their hair matted, their skins smeared with filth. A world where water was feared like poison and where even kings were said to reek of rot. The caricature is vivid and wrong. For centuries, this myth of the unclean Middle Ages has been repeated, even laughed at as though bathing was some invention of the modern world. The truth is stranger and far more refreshing. Medieval Europeans bathed more than their later descendants would. Public bathhouses stood at the heart of many towns and cities, serving as social gathering spots, places where merchants sealed deals, travelers rested their weary bodies, and friends gossiped in warm water. Some bathhouses even offered additional pleasures for a price, blurring the line between wellness center and entertainment hall. In these steaming rooms, nakedness was not automatically scandalous, it was communal. In monasteries, strict routines governed cleanliness. Monks were required to wash regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes more, with additional baths ordered on holy feast days. Soap made from animal fat mixed with ash or lye was not perfumed luxury but an everyday necessity. In noble courts, bathing could become ceremony with tubs filled with hot water and herbs, rosemary for the circulation, mint for freshness, sage for cleansing. A perfumed bath was not a sign of decadence, it was a statement of refinement. Even in the countryside, peasants were hardly strangers to water. Rivers and streams served as natural baths, while barrels filled with rainwater collected in courtyards provided a ready source for washing. Rain itself, falling freely from the heavens, left no excuse. Imagine a farmer pausing his labor as a sudden downpour soaked his skin, unplanned bathing, courtesy of the sky. And yet the myth persists. Why, ironically, the Middle Ages were far cleaner than the Renaissance that followed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, medical theory turned against bathing. Doctors warned that hot water opened the pores, inviting in miasma, the bad air believed to carry disease. As Europe entered the age of powdered wigs and perfume washing fell out of favor, courtiers drenched themselves in scent to mask their odor, while the 14th century baker or brewer might have been far fresher by comparison. Bathing in the Middle Ages was not only about hygiene, it was ritual. Royal baths might be scented with petals surrounded by music and conversation. Soldiers returning from campaigns were sometimes welcomed home with baths prepared by their lords both for cleanliness and for honor. To cleanse the body was to restore the spirit. In this sense, medieval bathing had something in common with Islamic hammams, grand bathhouses in cities like Damascus and Cairo, where the faithful combined cleanliness with community. Crusaders and merchants who encountered hammams brought back both admiration and envy, and some European bathhouses consciously imitated their design. The cultural exchange of water rituals flowed as easily as the rivers that sustained them. Of course, not everyone bathed daily, nor did every wash mean full immersion. Sometimes it was enough to clean the face, hands and feet, the parts of the body most exposed to dirt and most visible in public. But the notion that medieval people avoided water altogether is slander born from later centuries who preferred to see their predecessors as crude and ignorant. If you walked through a medieval market, you would not find crowds gagging at the stench of unwashed humanity. You would find bakers dusted with flour, smiths streaked with soot, children splattered with mud from play, but all of them lived in a culture where water soap and cleansing rituals were familiar. A 14th century merchant might have felt just as at home in a modern bathhouse as in his own, once he recovered from the shock of the electric lights. The Middle Ages were not 1,000 years of grime. They were centuries of people striving for cleanliness, sometimes succeeding, sometimes improvising, but never wholly forgetting the feel of clean skin, the scent of herbs in hot water, the comfort of emerging from a bath restored. The myth of filth says more about us, our need to imagine the past as barbaric, than it does about them. There is another stubborn picture we carry of the medieval world, one that shrinks its people into caricatures. We imagine men scarcely taller than children, knights forced to duck beneath doorways built for hobbits, women so small they might vanish into a wine barrel. It is a satisfying image because it fits the larger story we tell ourselves that the Middle Ages were stunted both physically and intellectually. But the bones in the ground tell a very different tale. Archaeologists have examined countless skeletons from medieval graveyards, and the results are consistent. The average height of a man hovered around 170 centimeters and women around 160. These numbers are close to modern averages in many parts of Europe. Yes, there were shorter individuals, particularly among the poor, where malnutrition and disease took their toll. But there were also tall guards, broad-shouldered masons, and market women strong enough to knock a foolish man flat for insulting them. The medieval world was not peopled by miniature figurines. It was full-sized humanity in all its variety. So where does the myth come from? Partly from architecture. Walk through the doorway of a medieval cottage or castle and you might bang your head. But those low lintels were not designed for undersized residents, they were designed to keep in heat. In a world without double-glazed windows or central heating, every centimetre of stone mattered. A smaller doorway was cheaper, warmer, and more practical, even if it meant the occasional bruised forehead. Beds too appear short by modern standards, but that has less to do with stature and more to do with posture. Many people slept, propped up half-sitting because they believed lying flat could suffocate them with vapours. After all, medieval air thick with wood smoke, dung and damp was not exactly a doctor's prescription. A shorter bed was a reflection of sleeping habits, not of smaller bodies. There is also the matter of diet and class. Nobles and knights feasted on meat, cheese and imported luxuries, fueling taller, stronger bodies. Peasants dependent on bread, cabbage and ale often grew more slowly. Malnutrition in childhood could stunt growth and famine years left their mark in shorter generations. But even among peasants, variation was wide. A blacksmith's son raised on a diet richer in protein might easily stand head and shoulders above his neighbours. Chroniclers didn't help the truth either. In their eager attempts to glorify kings and lords, they exaggerated stature as freely as they exaggerated valour. To read some accounts, kings towered like cathedral spires, able to kill a boar with a single glare. These portraits were not biographies but propaganda designed to awe their readers. And yet, alongside these exaggerations, the archaeological record grounds us. Skeletons from battlefields like Towton in England or Visby in Sweden show warriors tall enough to wield their weapons with ease, their bones bearing the scars of training and battle. These were not men tripping over oversized swords. They were fully capable of handling the brutal demands of war. What fascinates most, however, is how modern eyes interpret the past. When we see small shoes or suits of armor in a museum, we instinctively assume their owners were tiny. But many of those objects belonged to teenagers or to individuals who died young. Others have simply warped with time or were designed tightly to allow for layers of padding beneath. The conclusion that everyone in the past was short is less science than a misunderstanding born of scattered evidence. So were medieval people smaller. In some ways, yes, poor nutrition, disease and labour carved down more bodies than today. But they were not a race of human collectibles. A medieval crowd standing in your kitchen would not look like a gathering of children. They would look like us, tall and short, broad and slender, shaped by the same genetic lottery and only slightly more weathered by a harder life. The myth of tiny medieval people survives because it flatters us. It makes us feel like we have grown taller, stronger, more advanced. But the truth is, humbler our ancestors stood shoulder to shoulder with us. What separated us was not height, but the endless draught of cold stone rooms, the thinness of winter bread, and the weight of a life lived closer to the edge of survival. If you relied only on the history books of a century ago, you would think that the fall of Rome plunged Europe into 1,000 years of mud, silence, and ignorance, a blackout of civilization. No art, no learning, no progress. Just peasants bent double in fields while monks muttered endlessly over angels and pinheads. This picture, the so-called Dark Ages, is one of the most tenacious distortions in the story we tell about the past. But darkness is a trick of perspective. Step inside a medieval cathedral and you will find light filtered through walls of coloured glass, whole rainbows falling across stone pillars. Step into a university hall of the 13th century and you would hear debates that tangled Aristotle's philosophy with the mysteries of Christian theology, not the silence of an empty mind. The Middle Ages were not barren. They were bursting with energy, but in directions different from those the Renaissance later chose to celebrate. Consider universities. Oxford and Paris, Bologna and Salamanca, these were medieval inventions. They gave Europe a structure for higher learning that persists even today. Students, barely more than boys wrapped in heavy cloaks, pored over texts, arguing furiously about logic, astronomy, medicine. These debates might feel strange to us, woven through with questions of morality and theology, but they were rigorous, grounded in the best knowledge available to them. The so-called darkness was filled with conversation. And the art, one only has to look at the stone skeletons of Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, soaring higher than any building Europe had ever known. Arches pointed heavenward, walls thinned to make way for windows that burned with light. Far from grim, these were triumphs of engineering, art and devotion. And it wasn't just monumental architecture. Manuscripts were painstakingly illuminated, their pages exploding with blue and gold, decorated with vines, saints, and sometimes sly jokes, a rabbit jousting, a monk riding a snail. The medieval sense of humor still peeks at us through the margins. Technology too advanced. Mechanical clocks began to appear in European cities, their gears grinding away the hours for the first time with something more precise than the turning of the sun. Watermills multiplied, harnessing rivers for flour, for textiles, even for early forms of industrial work. Glass-making flourished, eyeglasses were invented, and in monasteries careful scribes copied not just religious texts but classical works preserved from antiquity. If you are reading Aristotle or Cicero today, it is because a medieval monk bent over his desk by candlelight, saving words from the teeth of time. So why call it dark? The answer is not medieval, it is Renaissance. Writers of the 15th and 16th centuries like to style themselves as the dawn, and dawn always looks brighter when you declare the night before was pitch black. By painting their ancestors as primitive, they made themselves shine all the more. It was clever marketing, nothing more, and it stuck. Later, Enlightenment philosophers repeated the slander, eager to portray history as a steady climb toward reason with themselves at the top. Another reason is literal. We see the Middle Ages today in dim candlelight, during reenactments in cold stone ruins stripped of colour, and our imagination fills in shadow. But medieval life was not lived in eternal gloom. Windows let in the sun, torches and lamps pushed back the night, and fires filled homes with warmth and smoke. Was it darker than your kitchen under LED lights? Of course. But dim is not the same as dark. In those flickering spaces, people still read, wrote, played, and dreamed. And for all its hardships, medieval life was not dull. Tournaments rang with the clash of armour, markets swarmed with noise, and bargaining festivals erupted with games, songs, and pageantry, so wild the church sometimes tried to ban them. Evenings were filled with stories, romances of knights, tales of saints, bawdy jokes whispered in taverns. Far from silence, the Middle Ages resounded with voices. What we call dark was in truth a different kind of light. A world where survival meant ingenuity, where devotion carved cathedrals into the sky, and where 1,000 years of people lived, not as shadows between Rome and the Renaissance, but as creators of their own brilliant age. When most people picture a medieval meal, they imagine a bowl of thin cabbage soup, a hunk of stale bread, maybe a few onions, and a hungry sigh. The caricature is clear. The Middle Ages were grey and tasteless, both in life and in food. But that is another story we tell ourselves to make the past look bleak. In truth, medieval cuisine was far more adventurous, spiced, and colourful than the stereotype allows. The kitchens of Europe, especially in noble households, thrived on spectacle. Imagine a roasted peacock served with its shimmering feathers, reattached the bird transformed into a centerpiece as much as a dish. Or a pie baked to burst open with live birds fluttering out, an early form of dinner theatre, equal parts feast and chaos. These were meals designed not just to fill the stomach, but to dazzle the eye, to announce status with every bite. Spices were everywhere. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, expensive, yes, but poured into dishes with abandon by those who could afford them. Meat, fish, and even wine were seasoned with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved today for teenagers dousing themselves in cologne. To serve heavily spiced food was to show wealth, for each pinch of imported flavor represented a journey across deserts, seas, and merchant networks. A noble table glittered with taste as much as with gold. Sweet and savory combinations were common too. Meat might be cooked with dried fruits, honey, or even sugar, which was not yet a household staple but a luxury commodity. It sounds strange until you realize we do the same today. Pineapple on pizza, cranberries with turkey, applesauce with pork. Medieval cooks like modern ones loved contrast. A banquet might shift from a peppery stew to a sweet almond custard, from a tart spiced wine to candied ginger. And it wasn't only the elite. Even peasants found ways to add flavor and variety. Bread and ale were staples, yes, but onions, garlic, parsley, and sage brightened the pot. Preserved fish, dried beans, and cheese supplemented the diet, while fairs and markets gave chances to taste imported goods, almonds, raisins, or, for the lucky, a sliver of exotic spice. For the rural farmer, a seasonal feast might mean roasted goose, fresh cider, or pancakes cooked in animal fat. These were not bland, but moments of indulgence in lives that valued every chance to celebrate. The truth is, famine and siege did bring hunger, and hunger does not leave behind cookbooks. The times when people lived on little more than bread crusts and cabbage were real, but they were not the whole story. Just as today's history of food would not be written from gas station sandwiches alone, medieval cuisine cannot be reduced to survival rations. When supplies were good, meals were vibrant, creative, and surprisingly experimental. Food was also symbolic. To serve meat dripping with spice was to proclaim wealth and power. To offer bread and ale to a guest was to affirm hospitality. Even in monasteries where meals were simple, herbs and fish were carefully prepared, and feast days turned the refectory into a place of abundance. What you ate and how it was served carried as much meaning as the clothes you wore or the banners on your hall. And behind every dish lay trade. Those spices that fired the medieval palate came along the Silk Road through Islamic merchants, Venetian traders, and countless hands. A pinch of nutmeg in a stew carried with it the weight of oceans, deserts, and empires. To eat well was to be connected, however distantly, to the great currents of global exchange. So the next time you imagine the Middle Ages, do not picture only cabbage and regret. Picture the blaze of a firelit hall, the scent of rosemary and ginger in the air, the clatter of knives on trenchers, the laughter of guests dazzled by spectacle and flavor. Medieval food was not bland. It was bold, sometimes garish, sometimes shocking, but never as flavorless as the myth suggests. If you learned your history from Hollywood, you might believe a knight in full plate armor was nothing more than a helpless tin can on legs. The moment he fell on his back, he was doomed, rolling like an overturned turtle, struggling to rise while his enemy politely waited to strike. It is a funny picture, endlessly repeated, but it is also almost completely false. Real armor was not a prison. It was protection crafted with astonishing skill to balance defense and movement. A full suit of late medieval plate armor weighed somewhere between 20 and 30 kilograms, no more than a loaded backpack carried by a modern hiker. The key difference was that instead of dragging on the shoulders, the weight was evenly distributed across the whole body. Knights could walk, run, mount horses, and fight for hours. Far from waddling, they moved with surprising agility. Medieval armorers were not fools. Their clients were men who expected to survive battle, not collapse in it. Armor was tailored like a second skin, articulated at the joints with cunning rivets and plates that allowed arms and legs to bend naturally. Surviving fight manuals filled with careful sketches show knights wrestling, grappling, and even performing roles while fully encased. Imagine two men in shining steel tumbling across the ground in a deadly dance that looks more like martial arts than slapstick. This was combat training, precise and brutal. So where does the image of the clumsy knight come from? Part of it lies in tournaments. In the 15th century, jousting grew into an elaborate sport, and competitors sometimes wore reinforced suits far heavier than battlefield armor. These were like the padded gear of a modern football player, excellent for protection but poor for running across a muddy field. To judge a knight's mobility by tournament armor is like judging a sprinter's speed by watching him in a mascot costume. Another culprit is the 19th century. When Europe rediscovered its medieval past, Victorian collectors commissioned display armors thicker, heavier, and less practical than the originals. Stiff gentlemen trying them on for parties or parades stumbled awkwardly, confirming the myth that knights were encased in immobility. What they wore was never meant for battle. And of course, modern television has not helped. A knight who falls flat and flails like a stranded beetle makes for easy comedy. The reality, a disciplined, agile warrior trained to fight for his life, makes for less slapstick though far more respect. Armor did have limits. A man encased in plate could not sprint a marathon, nor could he swim if he toppled into a moat. But on the battlefield, the suit gave him confidence. Imagine standing in a storm of arrows, each shaft bouncing harmlessly from polished steel while you advance with steady steps. Armor was not a handicap, it was power. It allowed knights to fight aggressively, knowing they could survive blows that would kill an unprotected man. Training began young. Boys destined for knighthood practiced not only swordplay but also conditioning, learning to move quickly under weight. They mounted horses without cranes, vaulted into saddles, and fought on foot with weapons heavy enough to snap bone through steel. For them, armor was not a costume put on for a few hours. It was a familiar companion worn until the body learned its rhythm. So no knights were not helpless tin cans. They were athletes of war, disciplined fighters moving with strength and skill inside their gleaming shells. The myth of clumsiness belongs to later centuries, but in the fields of France and the walls of castles, armor made men not weaker but stronger, not slower but braver. Another familiar story paints the Middle Ages as an age of ignorance, when the Church supposedly crushed curiosity, silenced thinkers, and chained science in a dark cell until the Renaissance came to set it free. In this tale, monks are superstitious scribes who fear the telescope, bishops burn anyone who questions the heavens, and learning itself lies buried until brave modern minds dig it up centuries later. But history, once again, is not so simple. The very idea of science versus religion is a modern lens, one that does not fit neatly onto the medieval world. For in those centuries, many of the people advancing knowledge were themselves men of faith, studying not in spite of the church, but within it. Consider the monasteries. Behind their quiet stone walls, monks copied texts, preserved ancient works, and experimented with gardens, herbs, and astronomy. When they tracked the movement of the stars, it was not idle curiosity, it was to calculate the date of Easter, the most important festival of the Christian calendar. In their quest for accuracy, they refined astronomical tables, compared observations, and developed instruments that later guided navigators across oceans. Universities, too, were creations of the Church. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, these centers of study grew under ecclesiastical protection, where students pored over Aristotle, Galen, and newly translated Arabic scholars. It was in these lecture halls that scholastic thinkers debated the nature of the cosmos, the structure of the body, and the principles of logic. To study the natural world was to them to understand God's creation more deeply. Translation movements fueled this curiosity. In 12th century, Spain scholars worked to render Arabic scientific texts into Latin treatises on medicine, mathematics, optics, and chemistry. These were not hidden from sight, but eagerly absorbed, discussed, and taught. The writings of Avicenna, Averroes, and Alhazen found their way into European libraries, sparking debates that shaped centuries of thought. Of course, tensions existed. Not every theory was welcomed. Certain conclusions that seemed to challenge theological doctrine could raise suspicion. The story of Galileo centuries later shows the dangers of colliding too directly with church authority. Yet even that tale is often simplified, reduced to a symbol of oppression when the reality was a complex struggle between tradition, evidence, and politics. In the medieval centuries themselves, inquiry was rarely about rebellion. A monk dissecting a pig to study anatomy or an alchemist experimenting with metals was not defying the church but working within a worldview where knowledge was part of divine order. Alchemy, astronomy, botany, all were ways of exploring God's handiwork. The image of suppression also ignores the church's role as a patron. Cathedrals rose not only as places of worship but as marvels of engineering, their pointed arches and flying buttresses the result of careful mathematics and daring physics. To build them was to combine faith and science in stone and glass. So when you imagine the medieval church, do not see only locked doors and burned books. See instead a world where prayer and study often went hand in hand, where the cloister echoed with debate and where the pursuit of knowledge, however framed, was not extinguished but kept alive until new ages built upon it. When people picture the Middle Ages, they often imagine dirt. Streets ankle-deep in muck, peasants caked in grime, nobles who never bathed, and cities that reeked so strongly you could smell them miles away. The phrase "the Dark Ages" has clung to filth as if the two were inseparable. But like so many myths, this picture is only half-truth and sometimes no truth at all. Cleanliness mattered to medieval people, and they pursued it in ways both familiar and surprising. Bathhouses dotted the towns of Europe, some public, some private. In Paris, by the 14th century, dozens of communal bathhouses welcomed patrons who paid for hot water, steam, and relaxation. Families might go together and meals could even be served beside the tubs. Though later moralists frowned on the mingling that sometimes followed these baths, their popularity shows that medieval men and women valued washing. Monasteries too wove water into their daily rhythm. Cloisters were often built with running channels where monks could wash their hands before meals, and rules required them to bathe regularly, sometimes more often than the average modern student might manage. For them, cleanliness had spiritual as well as practical meaning. To be washed was to prepare body and soul for worship. Cities developed systems to bring water where it was needed. Aqueducts, wells, fountains, and cisterns supplied the growing populations. In London by the 13th century, lead pipes carried fresh water from Tyburn to Cheapside. In other towns, water carriers hauled buckets to households that could afford the service. The infrastructure may have been simpler than today's plumbing, but it was there and it functioned. Nor were medieval people oblivious to the dangers of filth. Regulations existed against dumping waste in streets or rivers. Guilds of cleaners, rakers, and night soil collectors labored to keep towns livable. Granted, not every law was obeyed, and not every alley sparkled. Stench was a common complaint, but to imagine indifference is wrong. Medieval citizens fought a daily practical battle with dirt, just as urban dwellers do now, only with fewer tools at hand. Clothing, too, tells another story. Archaeological finds show linen undergarments worn close to the skin, washed frequently, while outer garments could be brushed and beaten to shed dust. Inventories list soap made from animal fats and lye, used to scrub not only fabric but skin. Scents of lavender, rosemary, and rosewater drifted from apothecaries, purchased not merely as luxury but as part of a regimen of hygiene. Of course, standards shifted with time and place. In times of plague, some feared that bathing opened the pores to disease, and so water fell briefly out of favor. But even then, people sought cleanliness in dry ways, wiping with cloths, changing linens, or applying fragrant powders. To be clean was always a concern, even if the methods varied. The myth of medieval filth lingers because it contrasts so nicely with the idea of modern progress. Yet when you look closer, you see people who valued washing, who built systems to carry water, who scented their clothes, and who believed that dirt was not merely unpleasant but dangerous. Their world was not sterile, but it was not the endless swamp of grime popular culture loves to show. So the next time someone declares that medieval folk never bathed, remember the warm waters of a Parisian bathhouse, the clean white linen of a peasant's shirt, the carved stone fountain in a marketplace trickling for all to see. The Middle Ages had their dirt, yes, but also their soap, their rituals, and their desire to be clean. Another image clings to the medieval world, the doctor with a beaked mask, the barber with his bloody basin, the patient left weaker after each visit. Medicine, we are told, was a barbaric business, little more than superstition and guesswork until the modern age swept the leeches away. But as with so much else, the truth is richer and stranger. Medieval medicine was not a single body of ignorance, but a spectrum of knowledge, tradition, and experiment shaped by ancient theory, local practice, and lived necessity. At the heart of it lay the humoral system inherited from the Greeks and Romans. Health, they believed, depended on the balance of four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, and illness followed. This framework endured for centuries not because people were blind, but because it often matched observation. Fever did make the body feel hot and dry. Melancholy did seem heavy and dark. The language of humors gave shape to symptoms people recognized. Bloodletting then was not random cruelty. It was a logical attempt to restore balance. Physicians calculated which vein to open based on the disease, the season, even the position of the moon. Charts survive, showing detailed instructions: cut here in spring for fever, here in autumn for congestion. Did it cure? Sometimes no, sometimes perhaps yes, by lowering blood pressure or reducing infection. At the very least, it was an organized system, not mere guesswork. Yet medicine did not stop there. Apothecaries stocked herbs and spices with real therapeutic properties: willow bark for pain, mint for digestion, garlic for infection. Manuscripts list hundreds of remedies, from honey salves to eye ointments made of saffron and wine. Some sound bizarre: powdered emeralds, charms inscribed on parchment, but others were strikingly effective, rediscovered centuries later by modern science. Surgery too advanced, more than the myths allow. Barber surgeons set broken bones, stitched wounds, and even performed trepanations, carefully cutting into skulls to relieve pressure. Tools from medieval collections, scalpels, forceps, cautery irons, look crude but reveal precision in practice. Manuals like those of Guy de Chauliac describe techniques still recognizable to surgeons today. Hospitals, meanwhile, grew across Europe. Founded by bishops, nobles, and guilds, they provided not only spiritual care but physical healing. Patients received food, clean bedding, and treatment. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, or the great hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, stand as monuments to a society that cared for the sick. Of course, medicine had its limits. Without germ theory, epidemics like the Black Death seemed inexplicable and cures often failed. But within those limits, people worked tirelessly to understand, to soothe, to heal. They were not indifferent nor wholly misguided. Their medicine was a bridge between the ancient and the modern, the mystical and the practical. So the next time you hear that medieval doctors did nothing but bleed their patients, picture instead the apothecary carefully measuring herbs, the surgeon binding a fracture, the nurse tending to a feverish child, the physician debating the nature of disease in a university hall. Their world was imperfect, but it was not devoid of care nor of knowledge. Another enduring myth is that medieval Europe lived sealed off from the rest of the world, a closed and silent continent cut adrift after Rome's fall until the Renaissance came to rescue it. In this version, medieval villages are imagined as little islands of ignorance, unaware of lands beyond their fields, and kingdoms as dim fortresses blind to distant horizons. Yet the Middle Ages were anything but quiet. From the beginning, Europe buzzed with voices, stories, and movement. Pilgrims walked roads that stretched for hundreds of miles, from Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela, from Cologne to Rome. Traders carried goods along rivers and across mountains, Flemish cloth to Italy, Venetian glass to the Levant, Scandinavian furs to Constantinople. Markets hummed caravans, jingled ports clattered with the sound of sails and crates, and the world beyond was never far. Islamic scholars translated and preserved Aristotle and Galen texts that traveled back into Europe and transformed its universities. From China came paper, first through the Middle East, and then into Spain, revolutionizing the way knowledge could be stored and spread. Spices from India, pepper, cinnamon, cloves flavored both food and medicine, prized so highly they were weighed like jewels. Ideas flowed too. Mathematics, including the numerals we use today, entered Europe through Arab scholars. Astronomy, medicine, and philosophy all bore marks of cross-cultural conversation. Even music and architecture carried echoes of distant lands. The pointed arches of Gothic cathedrals owe something to Islamic design, while instruments like the lute trace their ancestry to the oud. The Crusades, for all their violence, opened further channels of contact. Knights and merchants returned with silks, sugar, and stories. Some learned words from Arabic that slipped into European languages. Others marveled at technologies, compasses, astrolabes, irrigation systems that broadened their sense of what was possible. Nor was Europe itself silent within. Messengers on horseback carried royal orders, guilds sent letters across borders, and scholars copied texts that migrated from monastery to monastery. Universities by the 13th century became cosmopolitan centers where students from England might debate with masters from Italy or hear lectures on texts first written in Baghdad centuries before. To imagine medieval Europe as isolated is to miss the constant pulse of exchange. The truth is less of a dark age cut off from the world and more of a continent woven into global threads, sometimes tenuous, sometimes tangled, but always present. So when someone claims the Middle Ages were a time of silence and isolation, picture instead the bustling docks of Genoa, the crowded stalls of a Frankfurt fair, the ink-stained hands of a scribe copying words from Greek into Arabic, then into Latin. The world was not closed, it was porous, shifting, alive with contact. Another picture lingers in our minds when we think of the Middle Ages: that women had no voices, no power, no role outside the hearth. A world where men fought, ruled, wrote, and prayed, while women were shadows at the edge, silent and forgotten. But the reality, as ever, was more intricate. Women's lives were shaped by class, by geography, by the rhythms of household and market. And though restrictions were real, invisibility was not. In the fields, women worked alongside men. They sowed, reaped, gathered fuel, tended animals, and kept gardens that fed families through the lean months. In towns, women brewed ale, spun wool, sold produce, and ran shops. Records of guilds and tax rolls list their names: widows inheriting businesses, wives joining their husbands as partners, daughters stepping into trades. Some rose higher still. Noble women managed estates when husbands rode to war. Queens acted as regents, commanding armies, negotiating treaties, and influencing courts. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, was not only Queen of France and later England, but also a patron of poets and a political actor across Europe. In religion, too, women found space. Convents offered education, community, and authority. Abbesses could rule over vast lands, correspond with popes, and serve as spiritual leaders. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composed music, wrote theological works, and recorded visions that still resonate today. Her influence reached kings and emperors. Even in literature, female voices can be heard. Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 15th century, defended women's intelligence and dignity in her Book of the City of Ladies, challenging misogynistic traditions with eloquence and wit. Her work reminds us that medieval debates about gender were not absent, they were active, contested, and alive. Of course, women faced limitations. Laws often bound property to male heirs. Marriage, especially among the nobility, was a tool of alliance more than personal choice. Violence and vulnerability were real dangers. But to reduce the entire medieval female experience to silence is to flatten the richness of history. Instead, imagine a market square with women selling bread, beer, or cloth. Picture a noblewoman tallying accounts by candlelight, or a nun copying manuscripts in the quiet of her scriptorium. Hear the music composed by Hildegard, or the arguments penned by Christine. The Middle Ages did not erase women. They left traces, voices, and legacies we can still follow. If there is one image that clings most stubbornly to the medieval world, it is that of dirt. We imagine people coated in grime, never bathing streets filled with waste, and castles reeking of unwashed bodies. It is a picture painted by later centuries, especially by Enlightenment thinkers, eager to contrast their modern cleanliness with the supposed filth of the past. But medieval people were not strangers to hygiene. In fact, they valued cleanliness and devised routines to maintain it within the limits of their time. Public bathhouses dotted cities from Paris to Prague. In London, along the banks of the Thames, steamy bathhouses welcomed men and women alike, offering hot water, soap and towels for a modest fee. In German towns, bath culture was vibrant. Entire families might visit together, eating, drinking, and even conducting business while soaking. It was communal, social, and not considered strange. Private households had their own rituals. Buckets and basins of water were used for washing hands and faces daily. Linen undergarments worn close to the skin were changed and laundered, often serving as a kind of substitute for full-body bathing. Medieval manuals of manners scolded children to wash before meals, not to wipe greasy hands on clothing, and to keep nails trimmed. Monasteries took hygiene especially seriously. Cloisters had lavatories with running water channels, and monks followed rules about washing feet and hands before prayers and meals. Pilgrims too cleansed themselves at fountains before entering shrines, both as a matter of devotion and of habit. Even dentistry was not wholly neglected. Recipes for toothpaste survive using ingredients like salt, mint, or crushed herbs. Toothpicks and mouthwashes appear in medieval texts, showing that people worried about fresh breath and clean mouths much as we do. That is not to say life was pristine. Waste disposal in towns was often crude, and chamber pots emptied into streets made sanitation a recurring problem. Epidemics like the plague were worsened by overcrowding and poor sewage, but to leap from this to the notion of a people indifferent to cleanliness is misleading. They cared deeply, even if their methods lacked modern science. So the next time you hear the phrase "the filthy Middle Ages," picture instead a busy bathhouse with laughter echoing off the walls, or a knight's squire carefully scrubbing armor and hands before a feast. The medieval world was not spotless, but neither was it content to wallow in filth. Cleanliness was part of life, expected, encouraged, and pursued in ways that remind us how familiar these people remain. When most people imagine medieval food, they picture a wooden bowl of thin gruel, endlessly spooned up in smoky halls where meat was a luxury for the few and vegetables a rarity. A monotonous diet, bland and joyless. But the truth of the medieval table is far richer, more colourful, and often more surprising than this grey picture suggests. Bread was indeed the foundation, but it came in many forms. Peasants might eat coarse loaves made with rye, barley or oats, while wealthier households preferred fine white bread crafted from sifted wheat. In some towns, communal ovens allowed neighbours to bake together, turning bread-making into both necessity and social ritual. Soups and pottages were staples, simmering pots filled with grains, beans, leeks, cabbages, and whatever herbs or scraps were available. These were endlessly adaptable, sometimes thin and humble, sometimes thick with meat, peas, and spices. The idea of one dull, unchanging gruel dissolves when you realize each pot reflected the season, the household, and the imagination of the cook. Meat was not as rare as often claimed. Hunting game remained the privilege of nobles, but domestic pigs, chickens, and sheep were common across classes. Pork in particular was a favourite, salted or smoked to last through winter. Fish was abundant, both fresh from rivers and preserved by salting or drying. Religious fasting days, which prohibited meat, only increased demand for creative fish dishes. Spices, too, were central. Imported along trade routes from Asia and the Middle East, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, and ginger found their way into medieval kitchens. They were costly but not unattainable, and even modest townsfolk might splurge on small amounts for feasts. Far from bland, many dishes were sharp, aromatic, and richly seasoned. Fruits and vegetables filled the calendar: apples, pears, plums, cherries, onions, garlic, lettuce, peas, and turnips. Honey sweetened desserts, while nuts and cheese added richness. In noble courts, banquets dazzled with sugar, sculptures, and almond pastries. In village cottages, simple pies and porridge carried the flavours of local fields and orchards. And always meals were social. Eating was not simply refueling, it was ritual and community. Feasts marked weddings, saints' days and harvests. Even daily meals gathered families or workers with prayers, said bread shared and ale passed around. The stereotype of medieval people gnawing stale bread in silence ignores the joy of food in their lives. They delighted in flavor, they experimented with ingredients, and they celebrated meals as moments of connection. The next time you picture the Middle Ages, set aside the bowl of grey gruel and imagine instead a table with fresh loaves, savoury stews, herbs, fruit, and a pitcher of ale shared among friends in the glow of firelight. Few images of the Middle Ages are more unsettling than that of the doctor. We picture a man in a long cloak, his face hidden behind a beaked mask, carrying a staff to ward off the sick. We imagine leeches bleeding and bizarre remedies involving frogs, powdered skulls, or chants. In popular imagination, medicine in the Middle Ages is little more than superstition stitched together with cruelty. And yet, this is not the whole truth. Medicine was a complicated blend of ancient theory, religious belief, and careful observation, and medieval healers were often more skilled than we give them credit for. At the foundation stood the ancient system of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to come from imbalance, so treatments aimed at restoring harmony. Bleeding a patient was not cruelty for its own sake, but part of a logical, if flawed, framework of health. But beyond bleeding, medieval medicine included a wide range of remedies. Physicians prescribed herbs: chamomile for digestion, sage for wounds, garlic for infection. Apothecaries stocked elaborate mixtures, many based on centuries of trial and error. Monks cultivated physic gardens, carefully tending medicinal plants that still have proven benefits today. Hospitals existed, often attached to monasteries where the sick and poor received food, rest, and prayer. Care was as much about comfort as cure, but it was organized and intentional. Surgeons distinct from physicians learned practical skills, setting bones, stitching wounds, and even performing operations like removing bladder stones or cataracts. Tools such as scalpels, saws, and forceps survive, showing a level of technical precision. Nor was all medicine divorced from science. Observers noted symptoms, kept case records, and sought patterns. In the Islamic world, physicians like Avicenna wrote encyclopedias of medical knowledge, widely read and translated in Europe. Universities taught medicine as a respected discipline with exams and degrees. Of course, limits were real. The causes of plague, smallpox, or tuberculosis were beyond their understanding. Surgery without anesthesia was brutal, and infection was a constant risk. Superstition mingled with treatment charms and relics used alongside herbs. But to dismiss medieval medicine as mere barbarism is to overlook its earnest effort, its gradual progress, and the genuine care that patients received. The beaked mask of the plague doctor, so often used to symbolize medieval ignorance, in fact belonged to a later period, the 17th century. It was an invention of early modernity, not the Middle Ages. The myth persists because it is dramatic, but it is misplaced. So picture instead a monk gently applying honey to a wound, a surgeon setting a broken arm with surprising skill, or a physician writing notes by candlelight after visiting a patient. Medieval medicine was imperfect, sometimes painful, but also deeply human, a mixture of knowledge, faith, and hope that deserves more credit than it usually receives. When many people picture medieval women, they imagine a life of silence and submission. A woman cloistered in the home, her role limited to childbearing, her voice unheard in law, politics, or art. In this picture, she is invisible, a shadow moving at the edge of a man's world, and yet, like so many medieval myths, this image dissolves under closer scrutiny. Women's lives were more varied, more visible, and more powerful than the stereotype suggests. To begin with, medieval women worked. Far from being idle or confined, they labored in fields, workshops, kitchens, and markets. A peasant wife might manage livestock, plant crops, and sell goods while also raising children. In towns, women were bakers, brewers, midwives, and merchants. Guild records show women apprenticed and mastering trades, sometimes running businesses in their own name. Widows often inherited their husbands' roles, continuing work with legal recognition. Women also held authority in spiritual life. Nuns lived in convents that were centers of learning, charity, and administration. Abbesses governed lands, oversaw finances, and corresponded with kings. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen wrote theology, music, and natural science, their voices carrying across Europe. Mystics such as Julian of Norwich left writings still studied today. Even in the political sphere, women found space. Queens served not only as consorts but as regents, ruling during the absence or youth of kings. Eleanor of Aquitaine commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and shaped the culture of courts. Isabella of France played a decisive role in English politics, even leading a rebellion. Though exceptions, their stories remind us that power was not closed to women entirely. Marriage and family certainly structured much of women's lives. But even here, nuance appears. Marriage contracts could secure property rights for brides. Dower agreements protected widows. In villages, women often had a say in local disputes, their testimony valued in courts. Not all rights were equal and patriarchal limits were real, but within those structures women carved spaces of influence. Cultural expressions too carried women's voices. Troubadour poetry included works by female poets, troubadours, who sang of love, desire, and betrayal with their own authority. Women commissioned manuscripts, embroidered tapestries, and supported artists. The Bayeux Tapestry itself, one of the most famous artifacts of the Middle Ages, is believed to have been designed and stitched under female direction. Of course, the medieval woman was not free in the modern sense. Opportunities were bounded and social expectations pressed heavily. Violence, restrictions, and inequality marked many lives. But to reduce her to silence and invisibility is to erase the agency, labor, and creativity that countless women displayed. So instead of the myth of the passive shadowed figure, imagine a fuller spectrum: a woman balancing trade at the market, a nun writing a visionary treatise, a queen issuing commands in a royal court, a mother teaching her children songs by the hearth. These were the voices of the Middle Ages too, and they remind us that women, far from absent, were woven deeply into the fabric of their world. Few clichés about the Middle Ages cling as stubbornly as the idea that everyone was perpetually filthy. In this picture, people trudged through mud-caked streets, never washed their bodies, and carried the stench of unwashed skin wherever they went. Popular films and novels delight in grimy peasants, greasy nobles, and a Europe that only rediscovered bathing centuries later. But this picture, while colourful, is misleading. The truth is that medieval people valued cleanliness. They might not have known modern germ theory, but they understood the comfort and health benefits of bathing, washing, and grooming. Records show that even in small villages, people bathed regularly. A peasant might heat water in a wooden tub, scrubbing with lye, soap, or herbs. Wealthier households employed servants to prepare baths perfumed with oils and rose petals. In cities, public bathhouses were common. Known as stews, these establishments offered hot water, steam, and relaxation. Families visited together, and travelers could expect to find bathhouses in nearly every major town. In Paris, London, and Nuremberg, entire districts were known for them. Some bathhouses eventually gained reputations for vice, leading authorities to regulate or close them, but their existence proves that bathing was widespread. Even monks and nuns, so often imagined as ascetics who avoided bodily comfort, followed rules for hygiene. Monastic regulations prescribed regular washing of hands, faces, and feet, as well as bathing on certain days. Some monasteries built elaborate systems of running water and lavatories. The Cistercians, in particular, engineered complex plumbing to bring fresh water into cloisters. Clothing, too, was washed more often than the myth suggests. Laundry was labor-intensive, involving soaking, beating, rinsing, and drying, but households managed it routinely. Medieval people cared about appearance, and clean linen was a mark of respectability. Portraits and descriptions emphasize fine fabrics and fresh garments, not perpetual rags. Personal grooming was part of daily life. Combs made of bone or wood were common, and recipes for tooth powders using salt herbs or crushed shells survive in manuscripts. Manuals of courtesy advised washing hands before and after meals, cleaning nails, and keeping hair tidy. Far from indifference, there was a constant awareness of cleanliness as a sign of civility. Of course, standards were not identical to modern ones. Water supply could be limited, especially during sieges or droughts. Bathhouses sometimes doubled as social spaces where moral boundaries blurred. In times of plague, people feared that bathing might open pores and invite illness, leading to temporary decline in bathing. But even then, washing hands and faces remained common. The myth of medieval filth likely grew later when Renaissance writers wanted to distance themselves from what they called the Dark Middle Ages. It also stems from comparisons with modern standards of daily showers and scented soaps. But judged in their own time, medieval Europeans were far from indifferent to hygiene. So picture not a world of grime but a spectrum, a peasant scrubbing clothes at the riverbank, a family enjoying the warmth of a bathhouse, a monk rinsing hands in a cloister's fountain, a noble perfuming garments with lavender. Cleanliness mattered, and it was woven into daily rhythm more deeply than we might first believe. One of the most enduring images of the Middle Ages is that of a time when superstition reigned supreme, when people saw omens in every storm and devils lurking behind every sickness. According to this view, the medieval mind was incapable of reason, stifled by dogma, and waiting only for the Renaissance to reawaken rational thought. Yet, as with so many myths, the reality is more complex and far more fascinating. Faith was indeed central to medieval life. Religion shaped festivals, law, education, and daily habits. People prayed for good harvests, feared excommunication, and sought miracles at shrines. But to assume that faith excluded reason is to misunderstand the medieval world. In fact, scholars, monks, and even artisans lived in an atmosphere that combined belief with inquiry. Consider the rise of the universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. Institutions like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford drew thousands of students. Their masters taught not only theology but also logic, law, medicine, and natural philosophy. Students debated questions using Aristotle's methods translated from Arabic and Greek. They asked not only what does the Church say, but how can we reason through this? Far from silencing thought, theology itself encouraged intellectual rigor. Scholastics such as Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, and Duns Scotus argued through layers of reasoning, weighing objections and building careful conclusions. Their works show a mind trained not in blind acceptance but in structured debate. Science too flourished in ways often overlooked. Physicians studied Galen and Hippocrates, but they also conducted dissections, examined urine samples, and observed symptoms. Astronomers charted the movements of stars, producing tables used by sailors and farmers. Engineers designed cathedrals with astonishing precision, calculating loads and stresses without modern machines. Even ordinary people balanced belief with observation. A peasant might attribute illness to both divine displeasure and spoiled food. A midwife might pray while also relying on practical herbs passed down through generations. Superstition and science were not opposites, they were threads interwoven in a single fabric of understanding. It is true that fear of the supernatural colored life. People told stories of witches, demons, and curses. Charms and relics held power in the imagination. But these existed alongside real efforts to explain the world logically. The medieval worldview was not the absence of reason, but the coexistence of faith, tradition, and inquiry. Why then do we inherit the myth of a credulous, superstitious Middle Ages? Partly because Enlightenment thinkers wanted to paint themselves as torchbearers emerging from darkness. To celebrate reason, they had to portray the past as unreasonable. That contrast proved rhetorically useful, but it was unfair to the richness of medieval thought. So, when we imagine the medieval mind, we should see not a peasant cowering at thunder alone, but also a scholar debating Aristotle's metaphysics, a monk charting the heavens, a physician experimenting with remedies, a craftsman adjusting stone. To light in a cathedral. Theirs was a world of belief, yes, but also of questions, reasoning, and ceaseless intellectual energy. When people today picture a medieval village, they often imagine a cluster of thatched huts surrounded by endless fields cut off from the outside world. The peasants in this picture live their entire lives within a few miles of home, knowing nothing of the wider world, bound to the soil in a stagnant existence. It is a hauntingly simple image, but like so many other myths, it tells only a fragment of the truth. Yes, many medieval people lived in villages, and yes, daily life was shaped by agriculture. But to imagine these communities as isolated or static is misleading. Villages were tied together by webs of trade, pilgrimage, and communication that stretched far beyond their parish boundaries. Markets were at the heart of this connectivity. Even the smallest villages were often within walking distance of a weekly or seasonal market town. Farmers brought surplus grain, eggs or cheese. Artisans offered shoes, pots or tools. Merchants sold salt iron, spices and cloth brought from far away. A villager who never travelled more than 20 miles might still use a knife forged in another county or wear fabric dyed with colours that originated thousands of miles away. Pilgrimage also pulled people from their homes. Shrines such as Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury and Cologne drew travellers from across Europe. A farmer might walk for weeks to reach a holy site, mingling with strangers, hearing new languages and returning with stories and relics. Even shorter pilgrimages to a local saint's shrine created constant circulation between towns and villages. Seasonal labour carried people further still. Young men and women often left their homes for harvest work, for service in another household, or for apprenticeships in towns. Records show that villages were far from static. Families rose and fell in fortune, people married across communities, and land passed between owners. The myth of immobility often stems from the concept of serfdom, the idea that peasants were bound to the land. While some obligations did restrict movement, enforcement was uneven. Lords frequently granted leave, accepted payments, or encouraged migration to new settlements. Whole groups moved to clear forests, drain marshes, or settle frontier lands in Eastern Europe. The medieval landscape was in flux, not frozen. News travelled faster than one might think, too. Messengers carried royal decrees, priests read letters from bishops, traders brought gossip from distant ports. Ballads, stories and rumours spread along roads, weaving villages into the fabric of the larger kingdom. The Black Death, when it came, spread so swiftly precisely because people and goods were constantly in motion. So while it is true that most medieval people lived rurally and worked the land, their world was not a closed bubble. Imagine instead a farmer who walks to market and hears a tale from Flanders, who welcomes a pilgrim passing through, who sees his daughter leave for service in a city, who watches a neighbour return from crusade. Life in the village was grounded in the soil, but it was touched continually by the wider currents of medieval Europe. When you hear the word castle, what comes to mind? Perhaps damp dungeons, torchlit halls, grim-faced knights, and constant violence. In popular imagination, castles are brutal strongholds looming against the sky as symbols of oppression and fear. It is true that castles were built for defense and dominance, but to see them only as dark prisons of stone misses their fuller reality. In fact, castles were homes. They were political centers, yes, but also places where families lived, children played, and servants bustled. A medieval castle, even one with soaring walls and moats, was not just a military structure, but a hub of domestic and social life. Step inside a great hall, and you would see long trestle tables filled with food servants rushing to serve trenchers of bread, meats, pies, and pitchers of ale. At one end, the lord and his family dined on a raised dais, while retainers, knights, and guests filled the benches below. Tapestries lined the walls not only for decoration but for warmth, showing hunting scenes, biblical tales, or family heraldry. Light filtered through narrow windows, softened by cloth and colour. Private chambers offered more comfort than people often assume. Lords and ladies slept in curtained beds piled with furs and linen. They kept chests of fine clothes, books of hours, and jewellery. Floors might be covered with rushes and herbs, refreshed to mask odours. Fires in hearths gave heat, and shutters closed out the cold. While not luxurious by modern standards, these were living spaces full of daily activity and care. Castles were also places of culture. Music filled their halls, harpers, singers, and minstrels performed ballads. Ladies embroidered while squires read romances aloud. Courtyards echoed with the clatter of training knights, but also with laughter from children at play. Gardens bloomed inside the walls, growing herbs for medicine and flowers for beauty. Yes, there were prisons in castles, but they were often simple locked rooms, not endless labyrinths of torture chambers. Dungeons existed, but they were far less common than stories suggest. Most lords valued their captives as sources of ransom rather than subjects of cruelty. The everyday reality was negotiation, hospitality, and the balancing of authority with domestic order. Politically, castles radiated power. From their towers, lords enforced law, collected taxes, and hosted courts. Yet they were also centers of hospitality, where travelers sought shelter, where festivals and feasts marked the seasons, and where alliances were forged through marriage and diplomacy. The myth of the castle as only a brutal fortress arises from later Romanticism, when ruins came to symbolize lost glory or Gothic horror. In truth, these structures were alive with sound, smell, and movement, part stronghold, part household, part stage for the rituals of medieval society. So when we imagine a medieval castle, let us not see only cold stone and iron chains. Let us see children running in courtyards, cooks sweating over fires, ladies sewing by candlelight, and minstrels strumming songs of distant lands. Castles were not just machines of war. They were vibrant centers of medieval life, both fierce and tender. It is easy to picture a medieval peasant bent over a wooden bowl, spooning up a dull grey porridge, washed down with a mug of ale. The stereotype insists that food in the Middle Ages was monotonous, coarse, and barely nourishing, with only nobles feasting while common folk lived on scraps. Yet the reality was far more nuanced. While social class did shape diet, the medieval table, whether in a cottage or a castle, was more varied and inventive than the myth suggests. For peasants, bread was indeed the staple, but it came in many forms. Rye, barley, oats, and wheat mixed to produce loaves of different textures and flavors. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, vegetables, and sometimes meat, formed the backbone of meals. Far from being flavorless, these potages were seasoned with onions, garlic, leeks, herbs, and occasionally saffron or pepper if a household had access to trade goods. Dairy was another cornerstone. Cheese, butter, curds, and milk enriched the diet. Eggs added protein, while fish from rivers, ponds, and coastlines appeared frequently, especially during church-mandated fasting days. Meat was less common for peasants but hardly absent. Pork, often preserved as bacon or salted cuts, was the most accessible. Chickens, ducks, and geese provided both meat and eggs. In autumn, hunting and pig slaughtering festivals filled households with meat for salting and smoking, ensuring winter provisions. Seasonal fruits, apples, pears, cherries, plums supplemented meals, while nuts and honey offered sweetness. For the wealthy, food was both sustenance and performance. Feasts in castles featured roasted venison, swan boar, or peacock served with elaborate sauces. Spices from distant lands, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, demonstrated both wealth and connection to global trade routes. Sugar, still rare and costly, was used sparingly, more as a medicine than a sweetener. Dishes were colored with saffron or parsley, molded into shapes and presented as spectacles of artistry as well as flavor. Ale was indeed the common drink, but it was far from bland. Brewed at home in villages or purchased from taverns, ale varied in strength and taste, sometimes flavored with herbs like bog myrtle, rosemary, or yarrow. In monasteries, brewing was an art, producing both weak, small beer for daily hydration and stronger ales for special occasions. Wine was prized, but in Northern Europe it was expensive. In southern regions it was more accessible. Mead, cider, and perry added further variety to the medieval palate. Religious practice deeply influenced eating habits. Fasting days, sometimes numbering more than half the year, prohibited meat but allowed fish, leading to a booming industry in salted herring, dried cod, and even long-distance imports from the North Atlantic. Monastic communities became centers of fish farming, maintaining ponds stocked with carp and eels. The rhythms of feast and fast shaped not only what people ate, but how they experienced the seasons. Food was also symbolic. To share bread was to show fellowship. Salt was a mark of hospitality. At great feasts, the seating order determined who received the best cuts, turning meals into visible hierarchies of power. Yet even in small homes, meals were moments of warmth, storytelling and connection. So no, the medieval diet was not just gruel and ale. It was a tapestry of grains, vegetables, meats, fish, dairy, fruits and flavors woven together by local resources, religious practice and social custom. The table might be simple, but it was rarely empty, and it was never without meaning. When people today imagine medieval medicine, they often picture it as a world of leeches, chants, and bizarre potions, treatments guided only by superstition, devoid of reason or science. The caricature is of ignorant physicians muttering prayers while applying leeches to every ailment, or of peasants running to witches for charms and spells. But while faith and ritual were important, the truth of medieval medicine was much more layered and in some ways more thoughtful than this myth allows. Medicine in the Middle Ages was deeply influenced by the ancient Greek and Roman traditions, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates. These classical authorities taught the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and health was believed to come from keeping them in balance. While modern science has long moved past this framework, it was not irrational in its own time. It represented an attempt to explain illness through observation, cause and balance, rather than through mere magic. Physicians studied at universities, reading Latin texts and debating theory. They prescribed treatments that included dietary changes, herbal remedies and bloodletting when considered necessary. While leeches were indeed used, so too were plants we now know to have genuine medicinal value: willow bark for pain, mint for digestion, fennel for colds, and comfrey for healing wounds. Apothecaries prepared ointments, syrups, and powders, drawing on generations of herbal knowledge. Monasteries were key centers of healing. Monks tended gardens full of medicinal herbs, sage, rosemary, lavender, chamomile, and wrote manuals cataloging their uses. Hospitals attached to monasteries cared not only for the sick but also for the poor, the elderly, and travelers. Care often emphasized cleanliness, rest, and nutrition, which in itself made a difference in survival and recovery. Of course, spiritual healing was also central. Prayers, pilgrimages, and relics were thought to aid in recovery, since illness was often seen as both a physical and a spiritual trial. Astrology too played a role, as many believed the stars influenced the body's humours. While this may strike modern readers as fanciful, it reflected the medieval worldview in which heaven and earth were deeply intertwined. Surgery was cruder than today, but not absent. Barber surgeons performed bloodletting, tooth extractions and amputations. They set broken bones, stitched wounds, and even carried out rudimentary cataract operations. While there was no understanding of germs, antiseptic herbs and wine were sometimes used to clean wounds, and linen bandages kept injuries covered. Not every patient survived, but neither were these practices entirely without effectiveness. The Black Death of the 14th century revealed the limits of medieval medicine, but even in that crisis, physicians observed, recorded, and attempted to understand. Quarantines, though imperfect, were introduced in cities like Venice. Plague doctors, though later dramatized with their beaked masks, represented an earnest attempt to create protective barriers and order amidst chaos. It is fair to say that medieval medicine was a blend, part science as they understood it, part tradition, part faith. It did not resemble modern hospitals, but it was not the mindless superstition of caricature either. It was an evolving system rooted in careful herbal practice, ancient learning, and the search for balance in body and soul. A common myth paints medieval women as silent figures in the background, stripped of rights and influence, confined only to hearth and home, while men controlled every aspect of public life. But while medieval society was undeniably patriarchal, with laws and customs heavily favoring men, the reality is that women's lives were neither uniform nor powerless. Across villages, towns, convents, and courts, women carved out spaces of agency, authority, and resilience that challenged the stereotype of helpless subordination. For peasant women, daily life was a matter of sheer necessity. They worked the fields alongside men, sowing, harvesting, tending animals, and managing kitchen gardens that provided essential food for their households. In addition to physical labor, women baked bread, brewed ale, spun wool, wove cloth, and preserved food, tasks without which survival would have been impossible. In fact, brewing ale was so dominated by women in parts of Northern Europe that the term alewife became a fixture of medieval vocabulary. Far from powerless, these women managed households, balanced family economies, and were indispensable to their communities. In towns, women participated in trade and crafts. Many belonged to guilds or at least worked alongside their husbands in family-run workshops. Widows could inherit and continue their husband's business, sometimes running thriving enterprises in weaving, brewing, or textile production. Marketplaces bustled with women selling produce, cloth-baked goods, and dairy. While formal recognition varied, their presence in economic life was undeniable. Religious institutions also offered women avenues of authority. Convents were not merely retreats from the world, but centers of learning, spirituality, and leadership. Nuns copied manuscripts, taught girls, and administered lands. Some abbesses commanded great influence, managing estates, engaging in diplomacy, and advising kings. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess theologian and composer, remind us that intellectual and spiritual life was not exclusively male. Her writings on medicine, music, and theology reached far beyond her cloister-shaping medieval thought. At the highest levels of society, noblewomen exercised political power, sometimes directly. Queens served as regents for underage sons, negotiated treaties, and oversaw vast estates. Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most famous, ruled in her own right as Duchess of Aquitaine, accompanied two kings on crusade, and maneuvered within the politics of both France and England. While she was exceptional, she was not unique. Medieval chronicles note many women who defended castles, mediated disputes, or influenced dynastic succession. Of course, limitations were real. Women were barred from universities, excluded from many official guilds, and their legal rights to property or inheritance were often constrained. Marriage defined much of their social existence, and in many cases choices were restricted. Yet even within these bounds, women navigated and sometimes bent the rules to their advantage. Dowries, for instance, could give them leverage. Widowhood, while precarious, also provided more independence than marriage in some cases. It is also worth noting that the image of the powerless medieval woman was reinforced by the voices that survived overwhelmingly male clerics, lawyers, and chroniclers. Yet when we sift through legal records, account books, and letters, a more complex picture emerges. Women's names appear as creditors, litigants, landholders, and benefactors. They might not have had full equality, but they were hardly invisible. So while it is true that medieval women lived under a patriarchal order, it is wrong to imagine them as voiceless shadows. They worked, they traded, they prayed, they ruled, they resisted. Their lives remind us that power is not always measured in thrones or titles. Sometimes it is in the steady hand that keeps a household alive, the voice that shapes a community, or the wisdom that guides a generation. When many people picture the Middle Ages, they see endless wars, knights charging across muddy battlefields, castles under siege, villagers fleeing armies. Popular culture often reduces the entire era to little more than 1,000 years of fighting, and while war did occur, sometimes devastatingly, it was not the totality of medieval existence. For the vast majority of men and women, life was shaped less by warfare than by the quiet cycles of farming, family, and faith. For peasants who made up the great majority of the population, the battlefield was a distant reality. Their lives revolved around the agricultural year, ploughing in spring, sowing in early summer, harvesting in late summer and autumn, and tending animals through the winter. Days began at dawn and ended with the setting sun, paced by the seasons rather than by the drumbeat of war. Though lords and kings quarrelled, most villagers were more concerned about the weather, the yield of crops, and the rhythm of festivals. Indeed, festivals and holy days punctuated the medieval calendar, and they were abundant. Nearly 1/3 of the year was marked by some form of feast saint's day or communal gathering. May Day celebrations brought dancing and games. Harvest festivals filled tables with bread ale and roasted meats. At Christmas and Easter, churches overflowed with candlelight and choirs, followed by days of feasting. These occasions reminded people that life was not only toil but also joy, laughter, and shared abundance. Communal cooperation was also central to daily survival. Villagers worked together to bring in the harvest, repair bridges, or raise barns. In many regions, the open field system required coordination as strips of land were farmed collectively and decisions about planting and grazing were made communally. Disputes did occur, but cooperation was as natural as conflict, for no household could thrive in isolation. Even in towns and cities where merchants and craftsmen thrived, life was not a constant struggle against violence, but an intricate web of markets, guilds, and neighborhood ties. Streets bustled with bakers, blacksmiths, and cloth merchants. Markets offered spices, fish, and pottery. Guild processions marked civic pride, and pageants filled the squares with color. While occasional riots or feuds erupted, everyday urban life was more about bargaining for bread or paying guild dues than preparing for battle. War did come, of course, and when it did, it could bring devastation. The 100 Years' War, the Crusades, and countless local conflicts scarred the landscape. Armies burned fields, besieged towns, and conscripted men into service. But it is striking how even in times of war, people returned as quickly as possible to ordinary routines. A field burned one year might be ploughed the next. A town rebuilt after a siege would reopen its market square. War was disruptive, sometimes fatally so, but it was not the unbroken reality of medieval life. Even knights, often imagined as perpetual warriors, spent more time in training, managing estates, or serving their lords administratively than they did in battle. Tournaments, while violent in their own way, were as much social gatherings as military practice. They offered a stage for chivalry, pageantry, and the forging of alliances. So the myth of 1,000 years of war obscures the deeper truth that medieval life was sustained by cycles of peace, cooperation, and celebration. For most people, war was a background threat rather than the daily script of existence. The true heartbeat of the Middle Ages was not the clash of swords, but the rhythm of bells calling to prayer ploughs, turning the soil, and neighbors raising mugs together after the harvest. It is easy to imagine the medieval world as static, with people born in one village living their entire lives there and never venturing beyond its fields. The myth is that travel was rare, dangerous, and almost unimaginable for ordinary folk. In reality, while not everyone became a globe-trotting explorer, movement was far more common than many suppose. Roads and rivers carried traders, pilgrims, students, and even peasants far beyond their home horizons. Pilgrimage was perhaps the most powerful engine of medieval travel. Across Europe, shrines drew people of every social class. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, and Rome itself became magnets for the faithful. Pilgrims journeyed on foot, by horse, or by boat, carrying little more than a staff, a pouch, and their prayers. They lodged in monasteries, inns, and the houses of fellow Christians along the way. A peasant who might never have seen the sea could suddenly find himself crossing the Channel en route to Canterbury or trudging over the Pyrenees towards Santiago. These journeys opened eyes and broadened imaginations. Trade also propelled travel. Merchants moved along rivers, through mountain passes, and across the Mediterranean. Wool from England was sent to looms in Flanders, spices from the east passed through Italian ports, and salt from inland mines fed hungry cities. Merchant guilds maintained networks of inns and safe routes, and fairs like those of Champagne in France drew traders from across Europe. Even small villages often sent representatives to regional markets to sell surplus grain or buy iron tools. Students too travelled. The rise of universities in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Salamanca drew young men across borders, eager to study law, medicine, or theology. They walked from one country to another with little more than a satchel and a hunger for learning. Latin, the common language of scholarship, allowed a student from Poland to study in Paris or a Spaniard to sit in the lecture halls of Bologna. And then there were craftsmen, minstrels, and labourers. A stonemason might leave his village to work on a cathedral hundreds of miles away, spending years in a city before moving again. Troubadours wandered from court to court, singing of love and legend. Even peasants sometimes moved seeking better soil, escaping famine, or joining a relative in a distant town. True travel could be perilous. Roads were rough and bandits lurked. Storms could wreck ships. Yet for those willing to risk it, movement was possible and often rewarding. The existence of detailed maps, way stations, and travel accounts from the period shows just how much people moved and how often they shared their experiences. The greatest travelers, of course, became legends. Marco Polo journeyed from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan, bringing back tales that astonished Europe. But even his extraordinary voyage was built upon networks of merchants, caravan routes, and maritime trade that were already well established. He was not an exception to a stagnant world, but a dramatic example of its larger mobility. So the image of medieval people stuck forever in their villages is misleading. Life was more local than today, but not immobile. Pilgrims, traders, scholars, and workers crisscrossed the landscape, carrying news stories and ideas. The Middle Ages were not a time of isolation, but of slow, steady movement, feet on the road, sails on the water hearts, set toward shrines or markets. Perhaps the most stubborn myth of all is that the Middle Ages were nothing but the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of ignorance between the brilliance of Rome and the rebirth of the Renaissance. The phrase still lingers in schoolbooks and everyday speech, casting the entire period as a void of learning, light, and progress. But this notion, born from Renaissance pride and Enlightenment prejudice, distorts reality. The Middle Ages were not dark. They were luminous with their own forms of creativity, scholarship, and resilience. Far from being a time of intellectual stagnation, the period saw the founding of Europe's first universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Here students debated Aristotle, wrestled with theology, and refined the foundations of law. Scholastics like Thomas Aquinas worked to reconcile faith and reason, blending classical philosophy with Christian thought. Libraries grew in monasteries and cathedral schools where monks preserved not only Latin texts but also Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew works, copying and transmitting them across generations. Without their patient labor, much of the ancient world's knowledge would have vanished. The so-called Dark Ages were also an age of light, literally. Cathedrals rose with stained glass windows that flooded interiors with colored brilliance. Builders developed soaring vaults and flying buttresses, architectural achievements still astonishing today. Illuminated manuscripts turned sacred texts into works of art, with delicate gold leaf catching the flicker of candle flames. In music, Gregorian chant gave way to polyphony, creating the layered harmonies that shaped Western music for centuries. Science and technology flourished in their own ways. Windmills spread across the countryside, harnessing the air for grinding grain. Watermills powered forges and looms. Farmers introduced the heavy plough crop rotation and the horse collar innovations that expanded Europe's agricultural productivity. Astronomers tracked the heavens, physicians translated and practiced medical texts, and alchemists experimented in the twilight zone between magic and chemistry. Far from idle, medieval thinkers laid foundations that later ages would build upon. Even in philosophy and literature, the age was vibrant. Dante composed his Divine Comedy, Chaucer wrote his Canterbury Tales, and poets across Europe crafted epics, romances, and songs. These works were not pale shadows of the classical world, but powerful creations in their own right, filled with wit, devotion, and insight into the human condition. Why then does the myth of darkness persist? Partly because Renaissance writers sought to magnify their own achievements by belittling the centuries before them. Later, Enlightenment thinkers eager to promote reason over faith painted the medieval era as a time dominated by superstition and religious control. These judgments flattened 1,000 years into a caricature. The reality, as we have seen, was richer and more complex. Medieval people were not simply waiting in shadows for the light of modernity. They lived, laughed, built, dreamed, and believed. They tilled fields, brewed ale, composed poetry, argued philosophy, and gazed at the stars. Their world was not perfect. Plagues, wars, and hardships abounded, but it was no more dark than any other age of human history. And so as we end this long exploration, perhaps the truest lesson is that history is never as simple as the myths suggest. The Middle Ages were not a grim wasteland, nor a golden utopia. They were a time of resilience, creativity, and deeply human rhythms. To dismiss them as merely dark is to ignore the light that shone in cloisters, marketplaces, hearths, and hearts. When you next hear the phrase Dark Ages, remember instead the glow of stained glass in a cathedral, the murmur of students in a lecture hall, the laughter of villagers at a harvest feast. Remember that those centuries were lived by men and women as real as us, searching for meaning, building communities, and shaping a world that still echoes in our own. This, then, is the end of our journey, a journey through myths and truths, through shadows and light. The Middle Ages were never as simple as the stories told about them, and if we listen closely beneath the clamour of legend and exaggeration, we may still hear the steady heartbeat of a world alive, vibrant, and endlessly human. As we close this long wander through the myths and realities of the Middle Ages, perhaps you find yourself seeing those centuries differently than before. What seemed at first a shadowy landscape of superstition and hardship has revealed itself to be a world of resilience, colour, and unexpected sophistication. The people of that age were not so far from us. They laughed at small jokes, cherished family, worried about the future, and found comfort in food, music, and prayer. The myths told about them of dirt, ignorance, barbarity, and endless gloom dissolve when placed beside the quiet evidence of their lives. Fields were ploughed with skill, books were written with care, medicine was practiced with hope, and beauty was carved into stone. If their world felt harsher than ours, it was also one of astonishing endurance and creativity. To call it dark is to overlook the light shining through cathedral windows, the light of learning flickering in monastic scriptoria, the glow of hearths around which families gathered. And perhaps it is a reminder that every age is both shadowed and luminous, our own no less than theirs. So as you drift now into rest, imagine the bells of a medieval town echoing softly in the distance. Imagine the flicker of torches along a castle wall, the murmur of voices in a village tavern, the rustle of parchment turned by candlelight. These are the sounds of a world alive. A world that has never truly been as silent or as dark as legend would have us believe. Sleep well and let the Middle Ages keep you company in your dreams, not as a land of fear and darkness, but as a place of human warmth, endurance, and light.